Hello everyone, my name is Anastasios Dardis and I'm a higher education developer at the Education and Research Group at Esri, Canada. In this video, you will learn spatial interpolation in ArcGIS Pro. So, what is spatial interpolation? Well, spatial interpolation is a technique that uses geocoded sample points with values to estimate values at unknown points/areas. The reason this GIS method exists is that because it is more efficient to map unknown values at unsampled locations than it is to extract samples at every location. Additionally, extracting samples at every location can be quite expensive. To predict values at unknown points, spatial interpolation uses either deterministic or geostatistical methods, which will be discussed in the next slide. At its core, spatial interpolation applies Tobler's first law of geography to identify unknown values at unsampled areas. For review, Tobler's first law states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Thus, we could say that spatial interpolation is widely used across disciplines. The most popular use cases are in the fields of hydrology, soil, agriculture, weather and climate, atmosphere, land use, and topography. Here we can see an image of sample points in California collecting ozone levels, and then the next image is interpolating those values to display all of California. In spatial interpolation, there are two types of techniques, deterministic and geostatistical. The differences are the following. Backend, deterministic uses mathematics-based formulas, whereas geostatistical uses statistical models with spatial autocorrelation. What it actually does is that in deterministic it assigns values of locations based on surrounding measure values, whereas geostatistical predicts and provides accuracy. As for aesthetics, deterministic are smooth, whereas geostatistical are less so. And both sides have a wide range of tools to execute. Deterministic has inverse distance weighting, or known as IDW, natural neighbor, trend, radial basis, and spline. In contrast, geostatistical has kriging, co-kriging, empirical Bayesian kriging, or known as EBK, EBK regression, EBK 3D, and aerial interpolation. And lastly, deterministic are more simple to understand and process, whereas geostatistical are not. The next slide shows the concepts, advantages, and disadvantages of the most popular spatial interpolation model. For the sake of time, we will go through IDW and kriging as they will be used in the tutorial. Natural neighbor, spline, and trend won't be used. However, you will have access to this PowerPoint as reference when downloading the resource from our higher education page. IDW increases its distance decay weight when a sample location is relatively close to an unknown location. IDW is one of the most popular as it is efficient for large datasets, it's easy to understand, and it's good for high spatial density. However, it is not good for small datasets. It assumes that closer points have similar values, which is not good for abrupt changes such as mountains and peaks, and is not based on spatial autocorrelation. On the other hand, kriging is somewhat similar to IDW, except it considers distance and the degree of variation between known data points. Unlike IDW, kriging is prediction-based, has a wide range of methods, it's excellent for smaller datasets, and most importantly, it identifies interpolation errors, which demonstrates the model's performance. The downside of kriging is that it can be complex and requires background knowledge of geostatistics when modeling. It cannot identify values of the absolute min or max, meaning that values that are higher or lower than the current range. And lastly, kriging can be computationally intensive, indicating slower processing times. Both IDW and kriging are thoroughly discussed in the tutorial in terms of how they work. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with spatial interpolation, it is a multi-step and iterative process. First, you visualize the data on the map and see if there are any patterns or trends with the data. Second, you explore the data and see if there are any outliers or skewness. If outliers exist, you may need to remove it. If the data is skewed, you would have to perform some data transformation. Ignoring these refinement steps could result in accurate models. Next, you pick your spatial interpolation model, fill in required parameters, and check the model's accuracy by looking at a preview of it and diagnostic statistics via cross-validation, which is the fifth step. Ideally, it is best to have at least 2 models. That way you can compare each of the model and select the best performing one. Now the big question is, which model do you pick? Fortunately at Esri, they have developed decision trees as guidance to pinpoint the most appropriate models. Each decision tree asks you a question and it provides the result. These are: what type of information does your decision require? Which method requires measurement or model of spatial autocorrelation? What output type do you care most? What is the level of assumptions and how complex do you want your model to be? What type of interpolation you want? What level smoothness do you want? Would you like to have uncertainty of the predicted values? And how fast do you want to interpolate your model? These are questions you should ask before starting the interpolation process. So let's say you've selected your spatial interpolation models. There are several required parameters you will have to fill in. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet to properly define the parameters. Instead, it is an iterative process of experimentation based on a set of clues. These clues are mining and understanding your data, checking the model decision tree checklist, understanding the semi-variogram, and deciding the lag size, direction, type of model, and whether to combine multiple models into one, that is, if it is applicable. You'll only interpret the semi-variogram whenever you've decided to use Kriging, code Kriging, or empirical Bayesian Kriging as your spatial interpolation model. A semi-variogram is essentially what visualizes spatial autocorrelation. In case you're not familiar with spatial autocorrelation, it is a measure of similarity between nearby observations. In a semi-variogram, you have to look at when the model flattens out, or in other words, when spatial autocorrelation ceases to exist, by identifying 3 components. The first is the SIL, which is the maximum value or semi-variance. The second is the range, which is the maximum distance reached. And the third is the nugget. The nugget is the value at which the semi-variogram is virtually close to the y value. Here is an image of what it would look like. The nugget effect is an estimate of error affected by volume sampling. If the nugget is relatively high from 0, it implies of a large nugget effect, which is something to avoid having in the model if possible. If you do have a large nugget effect, then there could be measurement inaccuracies regards to predictions at unsampled locations, or spatial sources of variation at distances smaller than the sampling interval. In other words, it is unpredictable over very short distances. That is why it is colloquially phrased as a nugget effect, when gold miners come across a gold nugget in soils with very low concentrations of gold. The best way to reduce the nugget effect is to increase the number of samples, especially at closer intervals. The SIL, range, and nugget are impacted by several model parameters. The first is lag size that defines the increment distance intervals to measure spatial autocorrelation. Determining a lag size cannot be too large as it would skip short-range spatial autocorrelation, neither too small as it may not represent enough information. The rule of thumb is to take half of the largest distance among all points divided by the number of lags. For example, the largest distance between 2 sample points is 100 kilometers and you want to set the number of lags to 10. The lag size would be set to 5 kilometers. Another way is to execute average nearest neighbor tool in ArcGIS Pro and take the observed mean distance. If your sample happens to be clustered, then go for a smaller number than the observed mean distance value. Next, which is not required but may improve the model's performance, is lag tolerance. This is the tolerance range between lags, usually at half the lag size, which captures extra sample points. Increase the lag tolerance only if the semi-variogram seems to be erratic. Another important component is the direction. This is only used when you see a directional pattern or influence in the data, hence the term anisotropy. If anisotropy exists in the data, then set the angle tolerance, which is conceptually similar to lag tolerance, and the bandwidth, which is the maximum search width to include other sample points. The next is fitting the calculated semi-variances across the lag distance, which is then used to predict data values at unsampled locations. In ArcGIS Pro, there are many such as K-Bessel, J-Bessel, Hall effect, pentaspherical, and tetraspherical. However, the most popular ones are spherical, Gaussian, and exponential, given their simplicity and robustness. Lastly is combining multiple fitting models into one. This is only to be used if you have other variables that would influence the phenomena, such as elevation for temperature or biomass. Here are two images of what the parameters would look like if you were to do this on paper and on the map. In the final step of modeling, you would assess the blue line, or known as a semi-variogram model. The question is, does the semi-variogram model pass through the center of the cloud of bin values, which are the red dots? Does it pass as closely as possible to the average values, which are the blue crosses? And does it pass as closely as possible through the middle of the local polynomials, displayed as green lines? If the answer is yes to all of them, then you can assess the final part of modeling via cross-validation. Cross-validation contains the statistic diagnostics. These include asking whether the regression line, displayed as blue, is closely aligned with the reference gray line. Are the points closely aligned with the normal QQ plot line? Is the mean prediction error close to 0? Is the root mean square as small as possible? And is the average standard error similar to the root mean square? If you're using EBK-based methods, further questions you need to ask is whether the 90% interval is close to 90, the 95% interval is close to 95, and the average continuous rank probability score is as small as possible. If most of your results are within these guidelines, then the model likely performed well and can be exported. In ArcGIS Pro, there are several toolsets that can be used to execute spatial interpolation models. The first is the interpolation toolset located in the Spatial Analyst toolbox. This is more mathematical, based on value and distance, and is not interactive. The other is the interpolation toolset located in the Geostatistical Analyst toolbox. This one is strictly for the geostatistical methods. And finally, the Geostatistical Wizard, which has most of the spatial interpolation methods. This graphical user interface is powerful as it is interactive and provides previews of the interpolated surface before exporting. You will use this one in this tutorial. Finally, when you download the resource, it will consist a set of 3 tutorials. See how it is structured in the folder. Part 1 is to have a deeper understanding of spatial interpolation, which is an expansion of the video you are watching now, and I highly recommend you to go through this one first. Part 2 is applying of what you've learned in Part 1 by appropriately using the inverse distance weighting, kriging, and empirical Bayesian kriging to spatially interpolate air temperature in the province of New Brunswick. And Part 3 is to perform cross-validation and validation to identify which model is best to use. Thank you for watching the Spatial Interpolation resource. If you're a student, Please subscribe to our higher education listserv, where you can receive weekly updates regards to educational resources using ArcGIS software. If you're not a student, you can still follow us on Twitter at GISHAD. Lastly, if you'd like to learn more, check out our Higher Education Resource Finder page, and there you will find a range of tutorials from ArcGIS Pro to ArcGIS Enterprise.